Hey there, another 2 Minute Tuesday for you. And today, what we're going to cover is a little bit of work with selections, actually, specifically in Photoshop, using the select subject dialog. And so it's really powerful, but sometimes it doesn't work perfectly. So it's how to use this select subject dialog and then add more to your selection. And so we're going to use an image by Ulrich for that. As well, we're going to cover using transform tools. So on another image, we're going to use something we don't hear of often, Puppet Warp, to correct an issue along with maybe a little bit of Liquify. So let's dive in and see what we come up with here. We're going to go down here to Ulrich's folder, and there's two images I want to work on. One is this image here. And there's a couple of issues here with Ulrich's image, and it's just not coming home. There's this bright background, so we got the strong contrast of the dark and the light. So anytime you have a horizontal line cutting through a subject, it's sometimes a bit of a no-no, but that's not the major issue here. It's that the stronger contrast is behind in the brightest area and it's pushing forward, and the subject is a little softer. Now, Ulrich told me this plant is in the shade and it doesn't get hit by sun, so he tried to reflect some light back to it, or maybe even use some on or off camera flash, but it didn't quite have the effect he was hoping for. So I'm going to show you how to fix this in Photoshop. So let's just go now. Actually, I'm going to take away a distraction. This was a test subject here. We're going to remove this photo. So we only have this one to look at, and we're going to go to Edit In and choose Photoshop, and we're going to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments just in case we made any adjustments to this image file. And so that's going to pop us into Photoshop where we are now. And just so that I have something for quick before and after, I'm going to duplicate the background by pressing Ctrl or Command J. And you can do that also right here by right-clicking on the layer and clicking Duplicate Layer. So let's make sure we're highlighted on this layer. Now, there's a couple of things before we get started in regard to something I call border patrol, where I literally look around the border for distractions leaving the frame. And then I also look for other things. So I'm going to grab my healing brush tool, and there's a couple of things I see here. And one of them is right there. I'm just going to spot heal that. And the other one is this dark mark here. I'm going to spot heal that. And then there's a little bit of a web or a filament right here that's a bit of a distraction. And I'm just going to heal that out there. And doesn't need to be perfect, but there, that kind of takes care of those little distractions. And so now what I want to do is I would like to select this subject. Now, in the past, at the beginning when they had the pen tool, you could painstakingly spend a long period of time going around the whole outside of this image and then creating a feather, and that's really time consuming. But we have these great selection tools. One of them is the object selection tool. And so when you take your box and you go around the object and then you let go, Photoshop will really quickly find a somewhat reasonable selection, but in this case, it hasn't done a good job. It's not a complete selection. And so what's really cool is that we can actually make our selection better by picking the quick selection tool and adding to and taking away from this selection. So first of all, I can see this area down here we can add to. So I'm just going to hold my mouse down and drag, and it's adding to that selection there. And it's adding to the selection there. And all these little spots I can add to the selection, get it to kind of reread these spots. But sometimes it overdoes it. So if I press my Alt or Option key, I can take that away. Same thing with down here. It selected what I didn't want selected. So my Alt or Option key, I'm taking away from the selection by clicking in these areas where I would like it to not select. And so I'm going around with my Alt or Option key clicked and clicking these other areas. And it's doing a pretty good job of getting a rough selection of these areas that I need to take away from the selection. In here is another area right through the middle. There we go. Down in, oh, I took away too much. Now we can Control or Command Z back and try again. Try and get it a little sharper. Sometimes we got to finagle with it. Just finick with it. Here we go. Okay, and down here as well, it's not quite coming down. There we go. In this middle part here, yep. And down in here as well. There. It's looking pretty good there. Looking good there all around. Maybe pick up that black area in there, so we don't want that selected. I think generally for the demo we've got what we need. We want to add maybe a little more there, but we're going to do that. Now that we've got a selection made, we're going to first save the selection. So go up to the Select menu item. Down near the bottom is Save Selection. And just call this one whatever you want, but we're going to call it Mask. And we're going to save it. And that way, if we ever lose the selection, we can quickly get it back again. And now we're going to go into Select and Mask. And that's going to open up a dialog. Now, if you don't see this red jewel overlay, don't worry. It's probably on something else. Like if it was on the onion skin, and you might say, oh, there's no selection anymore. But actually there is. It's just that the transparency is turned way down. If we turn the transparency up and select, say, marching ants, or select any of the other ones, like on white, see, that works pretty well, or on black. But I'm going to just work with the red overlay here and turn my transparency down a bit so I can see some of the background behind it. And I'm going to quickly go around my subject and let go once in a while. And you'll be able to see as I go, it's really doing a good job at picking up the missed areas. There we go. And refining that selection. So this is a way to refine your selection. And I'm just working really quickly here. It's supposed to be a 2-minute Tuesday, so you should be able to do this in about 2 minutes. This edit is actually longer, so if you're already familiar with the tool, I'd expect this to be a bit of a 5-minute edit. But I wanted to throw it in on 2-minute Tuesday on selections, and just to show you how well this tool works. Maybe I could do it in 2 minutes. You know, I'll bet you if I didn't have to talk and I was start to finish, I could do this exercise in about 2 minutes. So we've made a rough selection, and it's not perfect, and it doesn't have to be. Often we spend way too much time painstakingly trying to get everything just perfect when this is going to work for us the way it is now. And so I'm going to say OK, and it's going to show me that selection. Now I want to do an adjustment to what I've selected. And so when we have a selection active, and we can see that by the marching ants, the next thing we do with an adjustment, it applies a mask to. So I'm going to just choose brightness and contrast. And we can see that it applied a mask. To see the mask, I'm going to Alt-click the mask icon, and it's going to show us our mask. And you can see it's imperfect. But it actually is okay like this because our edges aren't perfect. Some of them are soft. And it's okay to have a soft-edged mask. So Alt-click again to come back. We're going to click on the icon for our adjustment, and we're going to turn up our brightness. See that? And if we want, we can actually adjust the edge of our mask to feather it by clicking on this icon right up here. And I don't have the mask selected there. So I want to click on this. And then here, I can feather the edge a bit, so maybe 4 or 5 pixels, just to get a bit of a feather to our mask. And so we can close that. So that's one step, but I also want to darken the background. And so I'm going to go back here, but I've lost my mask. But remember, we saved it. There's many ways we can do this. We could copy this mask, do another adjustment, but I just want to show you I can select it to load my selection and go back to that mask selection that I saved right here and say OK. Now see the marching ants? Now if we want to do a brightness adjustment again, it's reloaded that again, but the problem is the selection, the white area, what's going to show our adjustment, is on the plant and not on the background. And so to change that, I'm simply going to invert. Control or Command I will invert our mask to black on white instead of white on black. And so that everything that's in white on our mask, and I'll show you the mask, will reveal the adjustment, and everything that's black will block the adjustment. White reveals, black conceals. And so go back to the adjustment, and we double click on that, and it brings up our panel. And so now we can deepen our background, maybe even increase the contrast a bit. We don't want to do too much, but we want that to go more into the background. And so we've brought that down. Now let's see what we've done with those two adjustments. We're going to Control or Command click, or pardon me, Alt click our eye icon so we can see just that layer, and that's with the adjustments. That's a pretty dramatic difference, I'd say. And so I'm really happy with that. I'm going to click it and I'm going to save it back to Lightroom. And I'm going to save it as a Photoshop document. I have Lightroom preferences set to save back as a PSD or Photoshop document when I'm working in layers. So I'm just going to say yes, and we can see it saving down at the bottom. That was quick. And we're going to go back to Lightroom now. It's going to be, pardon me, in the bottom, and we can see the before and the after. Excuse me. That's a pretty dramatic effect. I don't know why, but I suddenly got the cough, so I just inhaled. Have some water. The other image I'd like to look at is this image here. And this is a pretty quick fix in Photoshop. It's a little harder in Lightroom. The advice I had for Ulrich was, the next time, if you have a wide angle lens, see, he's taking it vertical and it's a bit wide and it's creating some distortion in the glass at the top. It's creating some distortion down here, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. But the glass looks a little wonky. And so, excuse me, a couple of ways I can solve this is, one, I use a different lens when I shoot, so I used less wide angle and prevent the amount of distortion, or shoot more above. But let's say this is what we've got to work with. Let's open it again in Photoshop, edit in Photoshop, and we're going to edit the original because I haven't made any changes yet. Just say edit. So here it is in Photoshop. So what are we going to do? One of the problems with using just a transform tool is we're going to lose our edge. If Ulrich had shot this a little wider, we would have room to do a little bit of transforming here using the free transform tool. So Control or Command T on our image. Whoop, escape that. I don't know why I'm not getting my Control or Command T. Oh, I can't do it to a background. So Control or Command J to duplicate our background. The reason this happened, I actually had a couple of pixels selected. So when you use Control or Command J, when something is selected, let me show you. I'm going to, for example, make a selection. See, we have marching ants. We have a selection. If I Control or Command J, let me delete that other thing. If I Control or Command J while we have a selection active, see, it made a selection of that. So Control or Command J is actually not duplicate layer, but duplicate the background unless there's a selection, and then create a layer with that selection. So if you want to duplicate layer, you can duplicate layer by right-clicking, or if you don't have a selection, Control or Command D to make sure I don't, I can Control or Command J, and it will make a duplicate of the background. So I just wanted to clear that up. Control or Command J is actually not duplicate layer, but duplicate layer unless there's a selection. So here we have the duplicate of that layer. We're going to Control or Command T to get our transform bars up. That command can also be found in the Edit menu under Transform. Now we can right click and choose Transform, but let's say we chose, for example, Warp or something like that, and we tried to warp that back into not looking bad. See up in the corner, we've lost the information from the background. If I unclick that, we'd have to content aware fill, and we could. That could be one way to fix it. But I'm just going to go back out of that. There are other ways that are easier working with the pixels we have so we don't have to twist the background. And so I'm going to pull up a filter that I haven't used in a long time, known as Puppet Warp. And that's found in the Edit menu down here under Puppet Warp. And excuse me, let me back out of that. I'm actually going to leave that for a second. And I don't want to puppet warp the whole image. I just want to puppet warp a selection. So I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool and I'm going to grab a selection. I'm going to grab all of that right there. And while that selection is active, I am going to choose that tool, Edit and Puppet Warp. And you can see that it's only going to affect there. So let's Command plus, pardon me, plus. Let's zoom in a bit. Now I can lock this outer edge in place so that it doesn't, just by dropping pins all along. Oops. Control Z. I don't want to click and drag because then that'll drag my background. So I'm locking the edge in place here as I go by dropping pins. So I'm just dropping pins to lock everything in place. Now I might have be able to use a less dense mesh, and I might still do that as we move forward from here. But let's just lock everything out here from being affected by my warping. Whoops, did you see that? I dragged a little bit. There we go. Drop that pin, drop that pin. Whoops, and yeah, I hit outside. I know. Drop. So there we go. We got a lot of pins on there. But that's going to prevent that outside from warping. And now I'm just going to click and drag because of the warping here. I'm just going to drag that a little bit that way. Put a pin here and drag that a little bit that way. See, what I'm doing is just getting that to be more an accurate, rounded shape. And this is actually a little tricky to do. So I kind of correct that stretched edge over there. And I think I want to do a little bit more. Just a touch over here. And when you touch one, it affects the other, so you got to be really careful. I think that's getting there. Oh yeah, that's so fine a control. There we go. I think that looks pretty good now. That circle's a little bit better. So I'm going to commit to that by pressing Enter. So I'm just going to show you before and after on that. So we turn that off. Do you see I've unstretched that now? And so I'm going to deselect now that selection by Controller Command D, removes our selection. And I'm actually going to grab the Liquify tool, and that's under Filter, and down here, Liquify. And what I'm going to be able to do is do a little bit of pushing and pulling on the overall perspective. And so I'm going to just make it a little bit smaller, that ring, and I'm just going to pull this whole thing over just a little bit there and push this back just a little bit. Just a touch. Now you got to be really careful if you got perfect lines, because if you start messing with your lines sideways, it's going to do that to them, and you don't want that to happen. So there, I've really, I think, done a fairly decent job of correcting some of that perspective issue. I'm just going to move that just a hair there, and just right there, just a titch. There it is. And say OK. And now what we've got, you can see what I can do, and I'm just going to Control 0, so we're full frame. If I spend a little more time, I would get a little more perfect with it. But you can see that I've taken that feeling of that twist of the edge of the page off. So Ulrich, I hope that really helps you. That's just one effect, and I wanted to show the Liquify tool and the Puppet Warp tool. I could just touch up a little bit just to get that arc a little smoother. Okay, let's go back now. And here we are. I'm going to switch views now, and I'm going to go to that. Oh, that was it. Hey, switch views. We did the other one. So that was your 2-Minute Tuesday. And in this episode, we covered this select subject tool and the quick selection tool used together to enhance our selection to make it better. And then the select and mask dialog to create a good selection so that we could isolate the subject from the background and then do a brightness adjustment to both the background and the foreground. And then we used the Puppet Warp tool, and we used the Liquify tool to help a little bit of a perspective issue from a wide-angle lens on an overhead shot for food photography. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next 2-Minute Tuesday. Talk to you again soon.